everyone. I'd be delighted to introduce Julie DeYoung to you. I'm going to let Julie introduce herself. So thank you everyone for joining, and we're delighted that you've been able to join us for this webinar. I'm going to hand over to Julie now, who's going to take us through a presentation, and then we'll do questions at the end. Please do add questions into the question box. I will be looking at the chat and the questions, and then we'll manage some questions at the end. So thank you. Julie, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Ursula. Good morning or good afternoon if it's afternoon where you are. My name is Julie DeYoung. I manage Tacoma Power's Shared Services Asset Investment Team. This webinar is based on a talk I gave at the IAM North American Conference last year, which was called Painting the Picture, Visual Asset Strategies for Better Decision Making. And hopefully you can see me, Ursula. Is the camera working now?
I can see you now, yes.
Perfect, thank you. The objective of today's webinar is a shared understanding of the benefits of visual asset management strategies. I'll talk about why we need these types of strategies and how they fit, the role they play in the bigger asset management picture. I'll introduce the concept in developing these documents, share some of the benefits around producing them, and then provide some examples pulled directly from one of our asset class strategies to show some examples of how the visualizations within them can help drive better asset decision making. Before I dive in further, a brief introduction to Tacoma Power. We are a municipal utility established in 1893, currently operating with about 850 employees. We are the fourth largest public power utility in Washington state, serving over 380,000 residents. Our portfolio consists mainly of hydroelectric power, with only about 10% drawn from other sources, including wind and solar. And of our hydroelectric power, about 40% comes from our own generation. We operate 4 hydro projects along rivers in Western Washington, and you can see a photo of one of our beautiful dams there on the right. So why do we need visual asset management strategies? Like most of you working in utilities, we're responsible for managing a complex infrastructure. Much of our equipment is expensive, entails long lead times to replace, and relies on deep expertise to maintain properly. So clearly we need good asset strategies to ensure we're caring for our assets in the best possible way for our ratepayers. And at Tacoma Power, we did have some asset strategies, and some of them were written very well. There was just one problem: no one was using them to make better decisions about work. And why not? Well, one problem was fairly obvious. These were comprehensive Word documents describing everything we owned in a particular asset class, for example, and documenting the maintenance and capital replacement spending associated, and a wide variety of other information about parts and processes. They were pages and pages long, and to our subject matter experts and decision makers, they resembled this wall of text, making them difficult to review, a hassle to have approved by senior leadership, and hard to reference later. Basically, they were ensured a lifetime on a shelf or somewhere on a dark corner of SharePoint. So when we set out to improve these strategies, we wanted to flip that script. How could we take something that was full of words but provided little value and provide great value using very few words? First, though, we needed to make sure we truly understood the purpose of these strategies and the role we needed them to play in the bigger asset management picture. So we went back to the core piece of our asset management program, our vision. We knew our goal was reliable long-term asset planning and investments backed by data and analysis. And we knew that getting there meant developing a series of optimal upgrade and replacement strategies for each piece of our infrastructure. We even knew the information that we needed to include to support good decision-making around investment planning, those categories that you see up there on the screen. One key piece that had been missing, though, was the ability to present all of that information in a way that allowed for collective decision-making. We needed to find a way to get the required asset information and analysis into the hands of our subject matter experts in a way that they could quickly understand and evaluate, then bring them together to make good collective decisions based on shared understandings. That's why the icon you see there at the right, the representation for those optimal upgrade and O&M strategies, doesn't show a document or a dashboard. It's a representation of the people who know best how to care for our equipment getting into a room together to review the health and projected future of assets in an accessible way and to make real changes to work processes based on that collaboration. Of course, given how large and complicated our system is, it would be impractical to gather all of the required data and information for the entirety of the infrastructure together in one place, then bring every expert around every piece of equipment into the room at the same time. So we broke up the infrastructure into 10 reasonable chunks so that we could write site, system, and asset class strategies that made sense for each piece and review them with the people who knew the most about that particular part of the overall system, effectively covering the entire infrastructure. We had two main goals in mind for these strategies, two main roles we wanted them to play in our overall system. The first is outlined here. We wanted each strategy to provide both long and short-term planning for relevant equipment, aiming for work planning and projections out at least one replacement cycle. For short-term planning, we wanted to do a deep dive on the upcoming budget so that we were able to identify with great clarity and review with our experts exactly what needed to be done in the next biennium. And to help with engagement and buy-in, we told our experts that in exchange for doing this deep dive on planning, we would document their approved plans in the draft 10-year capital improvement plan and also write their business cases for them, so that when it came time to produce those documents, they didn't have to reproduce their work. Just pull those drafts from a SharePoint repository, make minor updates as needed, and submit to our budget team. Once we documented the long-term plans for each piece of the infrastructure in our strategies, we now have a long-term picture of all of the projected infrastructure work that had been proposed and approved. We could move on to prioritizing our entire portfolio using the value framework that allows us to take things into consideration like resource and financial constraints, the ability to combine work to reduce the number of outages, and the highest priorities to our organization as identified by our senior leaders, things like safety, employee and customer experience, and reliability. The resulting scenarios for prioritized work over the next 10 years are what we are then able to capture in our asset management plan. And as we reviewed these strategies with the appropriate subject matter experts, we're also asking for buy-off on recommendations, asking, are these helpful? Does this recommendation make sense? Will it help you to make better decisions in the future? Is there anything we could add that would make this recommendation stronger? Approved recommendations are then tracked and implemented, building stronger and stronger knowledge around our assets so that when we gather to write and review the next iteration of the strategy, it's significantly more precise and helpful in making decisions about asset care. And I'll give some specific examples of data-driven recommendations later in the presentation. So this is the second role that these strategies perform. They continually improve the systems providing the information within them so that every time we come back to update and iterate these strategies, we have better data and information to work with, leading to better decisions about the assets within the strategies and ultimately to better asset management plans. Our asset strategies then rely heavily on a collective review and decision-making process with our experts. And if you recall back to slide 4 and that wall of text, you may realize that that type of collective review is very difficult if experts are asked to wade through page after page of words to understand what the asset data has to say. And that's why in reimagining how asset strategies could better perform their expected roles in the overall system, we decided to create visual asset management strategies. So what is a visual asset management strategy? For starters, it is not a Word document. Instead, we use PowerPoint to create these strategies in a format known as a slide doc. A slide doc is exactly what it sounds like. It's a cross between a standard PowerPoint-based presentation and a document. This format allows us to use way more pictures in the form of diagrams and analytical graphs built in Tableau so that rather than spend their time reading, viewers can more quickly absorb the information and move on to discussing how to apply it. And unlike a typical presentation where the content is intended to be supplemented by what the speaker says, this slide doc is meant to stand alone, meaning although we focus on analytical graphs and use significantly fewer words, there is enough analysis added through text that a subject matter expert could take this document away and learn everything we have to share within its pages. And while they contain a ton of meaningful content, these visual strategies are much easier to create and update than lengthy documents requiring traditional editing. That's because we don't need to recreate the visualizations every time. We can actually keep up-to-date data in a Tableau dashboard pulled from our CMMS that we're able to filter to then find the graphs and create the snapshots we need for our asset classes, systems, and sites. In summary, the key benefits of these visual asset management strategies are that they quickly provide a lot of information for faster collaborative decision-making. They can be developed using standard practices and standing dashboards that make updates and reporting quick and easy, and that keep the information current and available in an easily digestible format year-round, preventing the need to dig through the CMMS. And when it's time to formally develop the strategy and review it with experts, snapshots can then be taken from those Tableau dashboards using filters to pull out the data relevant to the strategy being written. And lastly, these types of strategies help highlight the importance of good asset data quality and the associated improvement recommendations, because areas where data is lacking become clearly visible to the subject matter experts and asset management teams when you can actually see those gaps in your graphs. Now that we've covered the role of these visual asset management strategies and some of their key benefits, I'd like to show some pages taken directly from our high voltage circuit breaker asset class strategy as examples. This table of contents is similar to those in most of our strategies in that we're attempting to tell a story about the piece of the infrastructure we're examining through identifying the assets in the asset class along with age, subclass, and location, the risk associated with those assets, the preventative maintenance undertaken to reduce that risk, along with corrective maintenance trends and capital investment planning scenarios, and their roles in maintaining desired trade-offs in cost, risk, and performance. I have some visualizations to share to highlight their role in providing information to experts in making better decisions. This page from the executive summary shows a summary of the total spending for the asset class within the overall transmission and distribution budget. You can see here that these breakers actually have a very small impact on that budget, making up less than 1% of O&M costs and just over 2.5% of T&D's capital spend. This was our key point in our discussions with our experts because just as we may not get a major benefit in terms of cutting costs from better managing our work around these breakers, it also tells us we may be able to afford to add work around the breakers if needed without too much impact to overall spending. Here's another page from the executive summary showing two different views of the work hours tied to high voltage circuit breakers. On the left, you see different types of work accounting for total labor hours tied to these assets. The red shows capital replacement work, with the orange indicating preventative maintenance hours and the blue corrective maintenance. Looking at the maintenance hours relative to one another helps us to determine if we're meeting that golden ratio of preventive maintenance, or 1 corrective maintenance action for every 6 preventative actions. In looking at hour breakers, we came in at 3.6 to 1, leading us to propose further analysis on whether we're actually over maintaining our breakers, at least until they reach a certain age in our system. This page shows a summary of the projected spend and work hours over the next 10 years for the asset class as a whole. On the right, there's a little bit of analysis around each type of work being done to provide context. And this information is useful in developing our 10-year capital plan, as well as in high-level planning for labor. One last piece from the executive summary here, some of the key recommendations for review with our subject matter experts. As I mentioned earlier, our strategies include data-based recommendations around capital investment planning, O&M strategies, and asset data quality improvements, all based on the data reviewed in creating the strategy. We highlight those key recommendations up in the executive summary as well. Here we have some examples from the body of the document showing some of the data used to develop and support the information in the executive summary. This is a basic slide showing the demographics of the asset class by age and subclass, noting that we do have some oil breakers in the system that are quite old and should be prioritized for replacement before we move on to upgrading some of our newer SF6 gas models. Next, we provide a simple Tableau map showing where each of these assets is located geographically. We've zoomed out quite a bit here to show locations that include each of our hydro projects, as well as our main service territory. We also have a corresponding graph later in the document that shows locations of our spare breakers and indicates why those spares are placed where they are to best support the system. Next, we show a summary of our risk profile for the high voltage circuit breaker asset class as a whole. The backdrop here is the standard risk profile map we use across all asset classes. It was developed in conjunction with our senior leadership team to identify our risk appetite and tolerance, and what it indicates is that any risk falling above the red line is unacceptable and needs to be immediately addressed. Any risk falling below the green line is something we're willing to absorb. So we may actually be spending there in an area where it would be better to do less mitigation. Anything falling between the red and green lines is something we're getting just right. Our maintenance and capital replacement processes are working to keep the risk at an acceptable level. For high voltage breakers, we worked with our subject matter experts to identify the list of failure modes you see there on the right, to understand the ways our breakers might fail to perform as expected. We then worked with those experts and our own data to assess risk for each mode, resulting in those risk distribution curves you see color-coded by failure mode on the graph. We can see that the distribution curve showing the risk for the majority of the failure modes just barely cross over that green line in almost all cases, indicating that the maintenance and capital replacement processes we have in place for high voltage circuit breakers as a whole are keeping us at an acceptable level of risk. There are probably some places where we can examine a little more closely because they fall under the green line, and that might indicate we're overspending money and warrants further analysis of the data to uncover whether we're over maintaining some of our younger breakers, for example, or doing a little too much to mitigate some failure modes when it would be more cost effective to just view them as acceptable. This is one of the graphs from our preventative maintenance section where we look back at historical spend per budget cycle, broken out by the types of preventative maintenance plans we use to maintain our breakers. This helps us identify required costs and resources for preventative work and track trends in those over time so we can project spending and resource needs into the future. One additional thing we were able to uncover by looking at the data across time in this way, overall spending on preventative maintenance had dropped pretty significantly in recent years. This helped us find accounting errors in the way work was being recorded that we may otherwise not have seen. And it helped identify some preventative work that had been neglected so that where that was critical, it could be performed and documented properly. We received a lot of appreciation from our work supervisors for identifying those errors and suggesting remedial action. Moving on to a couple of graphs taken from our corrective maintenance section. One thing that we're asking when we take a look back at historical data is, how good is this information? What data might we be missing that could be affecting our ability to make good decisions about asset care? Here in the little square inset at the top right, we're showing historical spend per budget cycle on corrective maintenance, broken down into failure mode. These are the same failure modes you may recall seeing earlier when we looked at the risk profile, which were identified by our subject matter experts. And that dark gray line that you see growing over time isn't attached to any one of those identified failure modes. That's actually our other category. What that graph is telling us then is that the quality of information is actually decreasing over time. This was concerning, so we took the time to actually comb through the free-form descriptions in our corrective maintenance work orders using some if-then statements and a manual review to further categorize the spend in that other category. And we found that although we did have some capital funds being misallocated to corrective maintenance, which was easy enough to correct through some added training, for the most part, the growth in the other category was being driven by a lack of specificity around small parts replacements. Just a note here about the value of data and identifying trade-offs in the time and effort undertaken in data collection versus benefit. When we asked our subject matter experts about small parts replacements for breakers, they told us they didn't really need to understand more about those parts or to have quote unquote better documentation. They mentioned the low cost and common availability of those parts, along with the fact that a limited number of crews address these breakers and they have some good training on the usual types of parts needed and a fair understanding of which might be troublesome. They didn't feel it was worth it to take more effort in ensuring those parts replacements were more correctly documented. Contrast that with a completely different scenario at our hydro projects. When our asset management team was first stood up, we needed to address the fact that we had nothing in our centralized maintenance management system at all for generation assets. So we went out to the hydro projects with some electronic tablets and a simple user interface for data collection, and we said to our mechanics and electricians, could you please collect information on several thousands of these assets so that we can create a centralized equipment inventory and start tracking costs and labor for work done on your equipment? As you might imagine, this was a pretty heavy ask for some pretty busy people. What we were asked consistently, though, at each location was whether the newly created work orders would contain small part replacement information. This was because they were working with some antiquated record-keeping systems that required them to dig through paper file cabinets to find parts information from the last time they did the same type of work 3, 5, 10 years ago. This group of people wanted specific, accessible record keeping about small parts replacements so badly that it actually motivated them to do the hard work of collecting asset data and creating that new equipment inventory and work order management system, despite all of the effort involved. Same type of data, let me flip back to that. So same type of data, two very different value propositions. This is a second visualization pulled from our corrective maintenance section. Here, we've age normalized corrective maintenance spending by failure mode. In other words, we've grouped failures by the age of the asset in the system when those failures occurred. You see a typical bathtub curve here where failures start a bit higher early on after installation and then fall before rising again after 30 to 35 years in the system. The reason the numbers drop at later ages, like 40 and up, is of course because we've replaced most breakers by the time they reach that age. So we're really looking at the 30 to 40 year period as the time when these most commonly start to fail more regularly. There's not a lot here in terms of specific failure modes, although with other asset classes, we have seen a steep rise in a certain type of failure at a certain age, which has allowed us to recommend some preventive maintenance interventions prior to that time to help head off those issues. However, we can recommend here that it's likely worth deeper analysis to determine if we need to perform inspections and preventive maintenance at the same intervals between 10 and 30 years of age as we do on either end of that age scale, particularly because we understand the risk, both the probability and impact of failure around these assets, to be relatively low. Here are a couple of extracts from the capital replacement planning section. On the left, the graph represents an extension of current replacement scheduling, showing what replacements will look like into the future if we keep doing exactly what we've been doing. You can see by the orange line there representing risk exposure costs that over time, those costs are increasing. This is telling us that eventually we will start to accept more risk around this asset class because we aren't keeping up with the aging of the fleet. On the right, we've suggested an alternative replacement schedule, replacing these assets at the optimal economic replacement time according to our whole life cost modeling and driving risk exposure costs down to near zero. We were able to discuss these visualizations with a collection of experts in the room, including system planners, engineers, our construction and maintenance supervisors, and our asset management teams and decided collectively that we could add 1 breaker replacement per biennium over the next several budget cycles, moving us gradually to optimum replacements. And we saw an additional benefit to our collective decision-making process here. While we were discussing this replacement schedule, our work supervisors let us know that even though they agreed generally with prioritizing oil-based breakers for replacement first, that we did have a pretty wonky early edition of the SF6 gas breaker out at one of our hydro projects. They were spending a lot of time driving out to do additional corrective maintenance and were concerned about the breaker lasting until its scheduled replacement time in 2029-30. They asked, if we're adding an additional breaker to the schedule for the next budget cycle, could we add that SF6 breaker? It will save us in corrective maintenance and it will help us develop a plan for replacing gas breakers, since that's work we've not done just yet. Everyone in the room was able to agree to this plan, and that's just a small example of a business change that resulted directly from this collective decision-making process in a way that likely would not have happened otherwise. And lastly, a snapshot from our recommendations around asset data quality improvement. What we're looking at here is a measurement indicating the percentage of work orders tied to high voltage breakers for which there is an equipment record added. In other words, can we tell from our work orders which asset or assets were actually worked on? And for the most part, what you see where those blue lines are is that when we do corrective maintenance, we're not doing too badly. However, with the orange lines representing preventative maintenance and the red lines representing capital replacements, we're significantly worse. In response, we were able to recommend both new training procedures and setting some parameters within our CMMS system, making it difficult to enter work orders without the equipment record number. These are really simple, straightforward changes that go a long way toward helping us more quickly mine our data in the future to assess whole life costing for our assets and make better cost and resource predictions. As I start to conclude, I'd like to share this quote from Jim Collins and Jerry Porras in their book, Built to Last. They say that building a visionary company requires 1% vision and 99% alignment. And in our work with asset strategies, we have found this to be true. The key ingredient in making our strategies useful has been the ability to use them as an effective delivery vehicle for data-based recommendations to our experts and decision makers. Without alignment around these recommendations and the data and analysis backing them, these visual strategies would be just as forgotten as our old wall of text type written strategies. Instead, they're helping us drive real concrete business process changes that collectively are moving us toward better decision making about our infrastructure. So to summarize our key points today, visual asset management strategies are slide docs based on analytical graphs with fewer words. Visualizations efficiently showcase data for decision makers to inform both long and short-term planning and to support continuous improvement with data-based recommendations. The major benefit of these types of strategies is that they more easily create a shared understanding around the data, bringing experts and decision makers into alignment around a big picture so that they can make the best collective decisions about future work. Thanks to each of you for attending today and listening to this webinar. We're excited about the work we are doing with visual asset strategies at Tacoma Power, but we always recognize that we have room for improvement. I've included my email here. I'd ask that if you have thoughts or suggestions for how these strategies could be made more effective or better used in building out our overall asset management system, I'd welcome you to please reach out, share those with me as we work to continuously improve our decision-making capabilities and service to our customers. Thank you so much.
Julie, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Really interesting. As you probably know, I've got an electricity background, so I was following avidly what you've been doing, and I've had the pleasure of seeing you present some of this stuff before. So it's great for you to come and share it from a webinar point of view. What I'd like to do now is just turn to the questions, because we've got quite a lot of questions that have appeared whilst you've been presenting. So I'm gonna just go through the questions. I'm just going to go through in the order they've arrived. I might just join a couple together because they're basically asking the same thing, but I'll make sure everyone gets their question in. So if you want to add your question to the questions tab, please do so. So the first couple of questions are really related to the same thing, and they're a bit of a process thing, really, Julie. They're about is it possible for people to get a copy of the slides? And
Yes.
and I can confirm that we are recording this session, so it will be available afterwards. We have to do a little bit of post-processing on it, so it will be next week before it's available, but we'll make it available. So it will be available, but people are interested in the slides as well, Julie. So if you're okay with sharing the slides, I'll leave you to decide that, but we can figure out a way to make those available as well.
Absolutely. So my email is included on that last slide. Please reach out to me. Happy to share, and even happier if you have feedback, suggestions, ways to make them even better.
Thank you, Julie. So the next question comes from Matthew Haitley, and he's asked the question, how long in terms of pages / slides is a typical asset class strategy? I think what he's trying to get an idea is sort of how many how big are they, how many pages, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the executive summary is about 4 slides. So I did show all of those in the presentation. So they give that kind of high level view of impact of budget, high level view of labor hours involved. And then, we put those key recommendations up front, and those are kind of laid out a little bit separately later on in the presentation, but they're all up there. And then a snapshot of the 10-year work plan with a little bit of an explanation as to the money and labor we're projecting. So all of that is really quick and easy. The idea being that for leaders, if they just want to take a glance at that, they can. The rest of the strategy has maybe 20 to 25 more slides, all of which are just supporting those conclusions that we've summarized in the executive summary. So depending on your level of interest, what your role is in the process, you may be interested in diving further into those slides. You might just be someone that wants the takeaway from those 4 at the top. And then we always do have, some extra information attached as appendices. So when I say it's about 45 to 50 slides, I know that sounds like a huge document, but for the most part, you can get really kind of the key takeaway right in that executive summary part up front.
Thank you, Julie. So the next question is a bit involved, so I'll read it to you, but it's about alignment, basically. So the question is, it's from Ayman Sultan. So they've asked, so I can understand the asset classes strategies well, but how can we align in a cascading way? So they're thinking about asset site strategies and then asset system strategies and then asset class strategies. So how do you ensure that they're not a conflict between different asset management strategies? I think there's a bit of a sort of, getting into the asset class or looking at the assets in a different way versus systems versus site versus asset class, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we struggled with that as well. And so what we kind of came to is zooming out a little bit and looking at the whole system and how those things tied together. So we looked at our whole infrastructure and we thought, how can we break this up into a way that makes sense? And so on the T&D side, it really did make sense to go down to the level that I was talking about here, that asset class level for high voltage breakers. And why? Because we couldn't get to a site strategy that involved those breakers without understanding more about that asset class itself, because there are so many breakers, they're so impactful, they take so much crew time. However, in our generation sites, we went straight to site strategy because we don't have, so many assets in those locations. So I think the first step is kind of zooming out and saying, okay, ultimately, what's our end goal? We want to get to this 10-year capital improvement plan that makes sense. In order to understand what we're able to produce overall in the infrastructure, we need to understand what we're spending in maintenance and capital replacement in all these different places. We need to understand consistently risk so that we can prioritize and set kind of a plan that makes those best trade-offs. So we took that infrastructure, we broke it up into those 10 sections. Within each of those types of strategies, We're doing the same things. We're assessing risk in the same way. We're projecting maintenance in the same way, so we understand hours and costs. We're putting those same elements in each strategy so that as they roll up, they're not in conflict with each other. So our asset investment plan actually looks a little bit different, but it follows that same type of storyline that our strategies do. It follows the storyline of here's what we own, here's what the summarized risk is around all of it, here's the, you know, the preventative maintenance that we're doing to offset that risk. Where we have corrective maintenance, here's what that looks like in terms of trends around, you know, resource and cost requirements. Same thing for customer service. And then we kind of roll that up into, okay, so here's now what we are looking at capital replacement wise. And we have consistent inputs to each of those things in our plan because we're assessing them consistently within each of our strategies. So that rather than conflict with each other, when we pull those all together, they actually all fit together and then kind of show us that big picture across the infrastructure.
Thank you, Julie. The next question is around how do you deal with uncertainty in the underlying data that is being used to generate the visualizations? I think this is a great question.
Yes, that is a great question because we all struggle with that, right? Definitely we do. So we've tried to address that within the strategy. So we have said these strategies serve two purposes. We want to use them to work plan. The other purpose is we want to use these to make them better the next time around. It's really about assessing what the gaps are. So we do that in capital and O&M planning. We put recommendations there, but we focus on asset data quality improvement recommendations as well. So as we're going through this data and we're recognizing things, and I think I showed a couple of visualizations from that data section where we said, you know, for us, it was as basic as, hey, but a good chunk of our work orders don't have equipment records on them. How are we supposed to track whole life costs without reading through every line for the description? We need to improve this. So we put specific action items in there and then we track those. So our job as an asset management team between this version and the next time we get together in 2 years to revisit this is to implement those recommendations. So now we're going to make those data changes. We're going to improve that the next time around. So that's one thing. The second thing I would say is that we try to be pretty clear about that in the strategy. So we try to directly address, here's an area where, you know, this is our best estimate based on what we're able to find. We're going to improve that next time around, but right now we're giving you that knowledge that this is a window. We don't have this nailed.
We've got quite a few data questions, as you can imagine. So the next question is based on data from Ruth Walsgrave. So this is such a great use of asset data, but I assume there was quite a lot of work to get all the data where you could access and analyze it. So this is more of a getting hold of the data. I mean, you talked about some of the records that were in filing cabinets, I think, or on site. So this is really about how you went about getting the data so you could access and analyze it.
Yeah. Hi, Ruth. So for us, we work in SAP. I know a lot of people use Maximo or a similar CMMS. It had been employed very differently across our organization. So our T&D group had been using it since about 2008. Our generation group, not at all. So part of this was we started with breakers and actually power transformers. Those were our best sets of data. So we actually started with those. And so part of this was an illustration of, hey, look what we can show you if we have good data. And so that was one thing. And I think I had mentioned in the presentation as well, when we went down to the generation sites, we were trying to hit on what matters to you. Because if you are a field crew, it's really hard to say to maintainers, especially when they're really busy, that in 10 years, we're going to be able to tell you what might be better to replace. They don't care, but they did really care a lot about having computerized records because their work is sometimes not frequent enough for them to remember what parts they need, what manufacturer they went to, how they ordered things, keeping things in stock. And so that was kind of the motivator for them to now go back through and start building those data records in the same way that T&D did. And, really they hadn't had that motivation before. It had been, a decade and a half, and they hadn't touched the CMMS, and now they're well on their way to having more robust data. So definitely a lot of help and support data collection on the front end from field crews and managers at those locations, but partly driven by the idea that if we get that data, we can solve your immediate problems on site, we can help you find out what parts you need, et cetera. But we can also, another motivator was we can also start in aggregate telling you, hey, you are planning for enough maintenance and corrective maintenance and customer service response for 3 times the amount of people that you have. So we're now going to be able to advocate for you to say, hey, they need more FTEs, or they're going to have to make some trade-offs in what projects they can do in addition to this capital work, or it has to slide. So, really kind of trying to hit on how do we motivate people to collect and maintain data and try to build that into the system.
Thank you, Julie. The next question is, how long has it taken in total to go from a document-based strategy to a completed visual strategy that can be used to make effective decisions? This is from Michael Nevin.
The very first one we wrote was for power transformers, so including substation transformers, our GSUs out at the hydro projects, and then our auto transformers at transmission. I would say the very first one took about 6 months because we were kind of trial and erroring it a bit with our SMEs, but now, so part of it is that we're building up those dashboards. So we're creating those permanent data pipelines, basically to pull that information out of our CMMS. We keep it in data tables, and then we can build those visualizations off those. All that to say, all of that data can live in standing dashboards. So what that means is when we go to update these, it's much faster and easier than it was the first time. So now it's just a matter of getting the first one in place, working through that initial process with our subject matter experts. And when we go to rebuild them in the future, we kind of have that system built and everyone has a common understanding of why we're doing what we're doing, and we can move a lot faster with the added benefit of those data dashboards being available all of the time so that we can quickly respond to ad hoc questions or share information if we see an anomaly pop up.
Thank you, Julie. So the next question is, how did you account for asset criticality? And this is from Ralph Ilmars Goddo.
Yeah, so we have a pretty robust criticality assessment and risk process that we employ at Tacoma Power. So that was actually built out by Todd Shepard, who was my coworker for many years, and then has moved on to work with AMCL. But he actually set up a system for us where we have that risk profile map that we developed with our senior leadership team that I showed, and we show everything against that risk profile map. So as we assess criticality and probability of failure, we create risk distribution curves, and basically we plot those against that graph because that can show us here's where we need to take action, here's where we're doing okay. The criticality assessments themselves, to get those onto the plot, as we're working through these asset class strategies, the site strategies, we're bringing in experts into the room. And so that criticality assessment is part of that process. So we identify our failure modes, we assess, where we don't have, we start with the data that we have, but we take subject matter estimation to put some parameters around those. And then that's part of that continuous data quality improvement process, right? So here's what we think we're starting with as ranges for criticality. Now, over time, let's look at this data and improve those, but that's kind of the start to get these strategies built, is working with our experts to build those in, get that risk assessed, build those distribution curves, and plot them against our overall map. So we have kind of a consistent look at risk all across the infrastructure.
Thank you, Julie. What advice would you provide someone embarking on making this change from sort of the text to a visual-based asset strategies? That's from
Yeah, I
Matthew.
would start with your friendliest group. Start with your group that has the best available data. For us, that happened to be in T&D, partly because we had people with, a motivation to get the data in earlier, but partly because distribution systems have a lot of the same type of assets, and so those tend to be really friendly to this type of analysis. So start there, kind of figure out what the motivation might be. For us, it was a lot on, hey, we have these wonky one-off things and we can't all get together into a room and figure this out. So, we're showing up at budget time and we're saying as C&M crews, hey, we need to do these things. This is what we're seeing in the field. And then our systems planners are saying, no, that doesn't make sense. And the engineering team is saying, well, we can't get the equipment because we haven't planned far enough ahead. And so the motivation for T&D was really, if we get together and we plan this ahead of time, we're all going to get what we want. We don't have a system in place where we're meeting together regularly and having these discussions. When we do have those discussions, they're often not informed by data, because I'm seeing one thing and you're seeing another thing, and it's really nobody's job to see this data across time and across the infrastructure. And so we're sort of debating what the reality is. All that to say is those groups, when they're experiencing those types of things, they're motivated to come together and to look at the data in this way. And our folks in T&D loved these strategies. They were thrilled to have something that they could call on to say, this verifies what we're seeing, or hey, we didn't know that, or this is a great way for us to actually know which direction we want to take and actually see that in the data. So yeah, I'd start there. I'd start with where you can see that people will really benefit from the results.
And this is a related question, Julie. It's from Matthew Linnell. And he's asked, any tips for how to shift an organizational culture towards data-led decision-making, such as you've shown in this fantastic presentation?
Oh, thank you. It goes back to hitting those benefits. So if you can see, everybody, from my experience, I have not been to a conference yet or talked to asset managers at another location where they're like, hey, we're nailing this. We have all the data we need. We know exactly how to make decisions. We've got a system. This is really hard. And so I think if you can find the motivation for the people, so it's not saying, hey, we want to go out and do this because in 10 years we're going to know what thing to replace. It's not, they don't care about that. It's more like, hey, what's your struggle? Oh, are you struggling with getting more things on the calendar? Are you struggling with non-availability of crews? Are you struggling with, here's another one that we've gone through. Are you struggling with budgeting your capital and your big projects over in a vacuum without considering your capital or your customer service and maintenance needs? So now when you go to do those projects, you don't have the crews and you can't get those done. Now you're not spending the money you've been funding for. And so you're now coming back and saying, why couldn't we get all of our projects accomplished? So it's those types of things that this type of planning can help address. So if you can see where those problems are, then I think the motivation for the turnaround becomes, we can solve these actual real problems by putting these little bit more robust data collection systems in place and then just bringing it together and talking about it.
Thank you, Julie. You may have answered this next question, but I'll read it anyway because it's from Tim Condon, and he's saying, having good quality data is clearly imperative. Has Tacoma Power developed a data strategy as part of their asset management plan? And I think this is, you sort of talked about how you're feeding into that, but it relates really to the data strategy. So. Yeah,
it's part of it. So for all of our asset classes, as we go through this process of developing these asset class strategies, I talked about how we have kind of consistent processes in each one. So one is about risk and criticality. We do that the same way every time within these strategies, so that when we pull those together into our asset investment plan, they look the same. they go together because they're all developed in the same way and have the similar type outputs. So same thing with data. So we address data in the same way. We start with a data dictionary. So we work with our subject matter experts. We actually start with, if you're familiar with ISO 14224 around reliability and maintenance of equipment, if you go in there, and it will give you a great start on, you know, here are your component parts, here's a boundary diagram for each type of equipment, here's what you might need to know data-wise. And so then we took that to our subject matter experts and we said, does this make sense? Are we missing anything? Are there other parts, you know, other pieces of data that you would want to add? And so that then became our data dictionary to say, here are all the things we need to know about this data class. And then we went through, or about this asset class, and then we went through and said, okay, so for each of these type of fields, what are acceptable responses? And so we can kind of put a parameter on what we're expecting. And then we went to our CMMS and said, okay, here's our end state, here's where we're trying to get. Let's run a report out of our CMMS and compare what's existing to that and see those gaps. And those became some of our asset data quality improvement actions. So that's consistently how we go about it for each asset class, so that collectively we're saying, here's what we need to know, here's what we have right now, here are the things that we need to do to get to that desired end state, and now we're going to prioritize those actions.
Thank you, Julie. This is the final question, and is it, how often are the strategies reviewed and plans updated as a result, and how manual is the process?
Yeah, so for us, it's every 2 years, and that's because we budget on a biannual cycle. So we know that our long-term capital planning for our organization is going to kick off in Q2 of the odd year. So in Q2 of the odd year, that's when our plan is due, because that's when we can most influence that process. And I'm sorry, Ursula, what was the second half of the question?
It was about how manual is it?
Oh, how manual?
Yeah.
Way less manual than it used to be. And that's because of those standing dashboards. So being able to create those data pipelines where we're kind of pulling everything out of the CMMS and we have it set up in data tables. We have a data lake at Tacoma Power. You know, you might have a warehouse or whatever your system is, but we have data tables set up, and those data tables allow us to build standing dashboards in Tableau. So those dashboards can be there all the time, you know, all throughout the biennium. They're filterable. So, you know, we might have a demographic slide that shows here's everything we own, but we can filter it, you know, T&D and generation. Okay, now we're going to filter it down to this asset class or this location. And you can kind of see everything there, so you can pull things off really quickly. So what we were trying to get away from was that manual process of digging through data, so that we could spend that time talking about the data that we already had at our fingertips.
Julie, that's the last of the questions. I do have a number of comments in the question area, which is about how really great your presentation was, including one from Ruth, you know, commenting it's brilliant work and it's a wonderful presentation. And we've got other comments as well about it being highly informative and a fantastic presentation. And I want to add my own view to that. It's really, really a great presentation, super informative, love the visuals. So Julie, I wanted to say a massive thank you on behalf of all the attendees and the IM for joining us and for sharing your journey on your visual asset classes, class strategies. And I think it would be really interesting for people who haven't had the opportunity to see the video as well. We will have the video available more widely to the members, but we had a great number of people on the webinar as well. So Julie, thank you very much on behalf of everyone on the IM, and I look forward to catching up with you and everyone else soon. Thank you everyone for joining, really appreciate it. I realise people joined from all over the world, so thank you very much. Thank you.